At a surface level, the answer seems obvious. Yes, narcissists care deeply about their reputation. In fact, many people would argue that they care more about how they are perceived than anything else. They curate their image, manage impressions, and often go to great lengths to appear admirable, competent, or even exceptional in the eyes of others. But this answer, while partially true, is incomplete. Because the real question is not whether they care about their reputation. The real question is how they care about it, and why. And once you understand that distinction, the entire dynamic begins to look very different. Reputation, for most people, is a byproduct of behavior over time. It reflects patterns, how someone treats others, how consistent they are, how they respond under pressure. It is not something that needs to be constantly engineered. It develops naturally through lived experience and social feedback. For individuals with strong narcissistic tendencies, however, reputation is not a passive outcome. It is an active construction. It becomes part of a psychological framework designed to maintain a specific self-image. This self-image is not always stable internally. It often requires external reinforcement to remain intact. And reputation, in this context, functions as a form of external validation, evidence that the desired identity is being recognized and confirmed by others. This is where the distinction begins to matter. It is not reputation in the sense of authenticity that is being protected. It is reputation as a reflection, a controlled projection of how one wants to be seen. And protecting that reflection can become a priority. Sometimes, even more than protecting relationships themselves. This is why behaviors that seem contradictory on the surface can coexist. An individual may act in ways that are harmful, dismissive, or inconsistent in private, while simultaneously maintaining a polished and convincing public image. To an outside observer, the contrast can be difficult to reconcile. The person appears credible, even admirable. The reports of their behavior seem exaggerated or unlikely. But the discrepancy is not accidental. It is structural. The public image is curated because it serves a function. It stabilizes perception. It builds credibility. It creates a buffer against criticism. And perhaps most importantly, it provides a form of psychological security. If others believe in the image, it becomes easier to believe in it internally. This dynamic also explains why threats to reputation can trigger disproportionately strong reactions. Criticism, exposure, or even subtle challenges to the curated image are not experienced as minor social feedback. They are experienced as destabilizing events. Because what is being challenged is not just how one is seen, but how one sees oneself. In response, a range of defensive behaviors may emerge. These can include denial, minimization, reframing, or shifting blame. In some cases, the focus shifts from addressing the issue to controlling the narrative around it. What matters is not necessarily what happened, but how it is interpreted and by whom. This is where reputation management becomes more visible. Conversations may be selectively presented. Information may be withheld or restructured. Certain aspects of reality are emphasized, while others are omitted. The goal is not always to fabricate an entirely false story, but to guide perception in a way that preserves the desired image. This process can be subtle. It does not always involve overt manipulation. It can occur through tone, implication, and strategic emphasis. Over time, however, it creates a version of reality that is aligned with the individual's self-image, rather than with a fully balanced account of events. For those on the receiving end of this dynamic, the experience can be disorienting. There is often a gap between private interactions and public perception. Attempts to communicate concerns may be dismissed or reframed. Efforts to clarify what happened may lead to further confusion, especially when external feedback contradicts personal experience. This creates a kind of perceptual conflict. On one hand, there is lived reality. On the other, there is socially reinforced narrative. And when the two do not align, it can become difficult to trust one's own interpretation of events. Understanding the role of reputation in this context helps explain why this conflict occurs. If reputation functions as a core stabilizing mechanism, then preserving it becomes a priority. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of psychological necessity. The image must remain intact, because it supports a broader internal structure. This also sheds light on another important point: the difference between caring about reputation and caring about truth. For most people, these two concepts are linked. A good reputation is ideally grounded in truthful behavior. Consistency between internal values and external perception is seen as desirable. In narcissistic dynamics, however, the link can become loosened. What matters more is coherence of image, not necessarily accuracy of representation. If the image is preserved, the system remains stable. If the image is threatened, the system reacts. This is why actions that appear disproportionate, such as intense defensiveness, reputation repair efforts, or attempts to control how others are perceived, often occur in response to relatively small triggers. The trigger itself may be minor, but its implications for the self-image are not. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this pattern does not exist in isolation. It is influenced by context, environment, and reinforcement. In social environments where image is highly valued, where visibility, status, or perception carry significant weight, the tendency to prioritize reputation can be amplified. In such contexts, the line between authentic self-presentation and strategic image management becomes increasingly blurred. This raises a broader question. To what extent is this behavior unique, and to what extent is it an exaggerated version of something more common? After all, most people engage in some form of impression management. They present themselves differently in different contexts. They highlight certain traits and downplay others. They care, to some degree, about how they are perceived. The difference lies in degree, rigidity, and dependency. When reputation becomes central to identity, when it is not just important, but necessary for psychological stability, the behavior surrounding it becomes more intense, more consistent, and less flexible. It is no longer adaptive. It becomes structural. And when something is structural, it shapes everything else. Relationships become influenced by how they affect perception. Conflicts are evaluated not only in terms of resolution, but in terms of narrative. Decisions are filtered through the question, how will this reflect on me? Over time, this creates a pattern. A pattern where image is prioritized, perception is managed, and reality is selectively interpreted. From the outside, it may appear as confidence, control, or composure. From the inside, it may function as regulation, a way to maintain a sense of self that might otherwise feel unstable. Recognizing this pattern does not require labeling or diagnosing. It requires observation. It involves paying attention to consistency between words and actions. It involves noticing how someone responds to criticism, how they handle accountability, and how they navigate discrepancies between private behavior and public image. These indicators are often more informative than any label. Because at the end of the day, reputation is not inherently problematic. It becomes problematic when it replaces authenticity, when it overrides accountability, and when it distorts perception, both for the individual and for those around them. So, do narcissists really care about their reputation? Yes, but not in the way the question initially suggests. They care about it not simply as a reflection of who they are, but as a structure that supports how they see themselves. It is less about truth, and more about coherence. Less about reality, and more about perception. And that difference changes everything. Because when perception becomes more important than reality, the goal is no longer to be understood accurately. The goal is to be seen a certain way. And once that becomes the priority, the line between who someone is and how they appear can become increasingly difficult to distinguish.